You're just a night nurse. Stay in your lane." The new director said it loud enough for the whole ward to hear, and the ward went still the way a room goes still when something has broken that cannot be put back. Maren Cole did not flinch. She set the empty saline bag in the sharp spin, smoothed the blanket over the old man in bed 3, and let the silence hold for the length of one breath before she answered, because she had learned a long time ago, in a place she never talked about, that the people who shout are the ones afraid of the quiet. What Howard Pace did not know, what nobody on the fourth floor of St. Brennan Mercy knew, was that the woman he had just ordered out of his way had once kept 11 soldiers breathing through a single night with 2 hands and a headlamp, and that there was a man 2 doors down, in room 9, who was about to recognize her face. 3 weeks from that night, in front of the same staff who looked at their shoes when the director raised his voice, a retired general would push himself up out of a hospital bed on legs that should not have held him, lift a trembling hand to his brow, and hold it there until everyone in the corridor understood that the woman they had called just a night nurse outranked every person in the building. But that comes later. First, you have to understand the hush, and the man who broke it, and the 8 patients who would not have lived to see morning if Maren Cole had decided that night to stay in her lane. Before we go further, if a story about the people who get overlooked, the ones who do the work while the loud men take the credit, is the kind of story you came here for, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button and the like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I genuinely want to see how far this one travels. Phoenix, Manila, a kitchen table in Glasgow at 2 in the morning. Put it down there. Tell me you're here, and then stay with me, because what happens in room 9 is the part nobody sees coming. St. Brennan Mercy was the kind of hospital the city forgot it had until somebody needed it at 3 in the morning. It sat on the wrong side of the river in a brick building that had been added onto so many times the hallways no longer agreed with each other, and its budget had been cut every year for 9 years running. The night shift on 4 East ran on 6 nurses where the staffing grid called for 10, on a coffee machine that had to be slapped on its left side to start, and on Maren Cole, who had worked nights there for 4 years and could tell you the name, the diagnosis, and the grandchildren of every long-term patient on the unit. She was 41. She wore plain blue scrubs that had gone soft from 1,000 washings, sensible shoes, no rings, no makeup that anyone noticed. Her dark hair was going to gray at the temples, and she pinned it back without ceremony at the start of every shift. People who met her took about 4 seconds to file her away as the quiet one, the steady one, the one who never made a fuss, and they were not wrong, exactly. They just did not see the rest of it. They did not see the small brass coin she kept in her left scrub pocket, worn smooth at the edges, that she touched sometimes without seeming to know she was doing it. They did not know that she could intubate a patient in the dark in under 30 seconds, that she could read a rhythm strip before the monitor finished printing it, that she had a way of going very still and very calm in the exact moment everyone else started to come apart. They had no reason to know. She had spent 11 years making sure no one had a reason to know. She noticed things, was the simplest way to put it. She noticed the way old Mr. Delgado in 3 favored his left side when he thought no one was looking, weeks before his stroke showed on any scan. She noticed when the new aide was crying in the supply closet and left a granola bar on the shelf without a word. And lately, for about 2 months now, she had been noticing something else, something she did not have a name for yet, something that made the brass coin warm under her thumb at odd hours of the night. People were dying on 4 East who should not have been dying. Not many, not enough that anyone running the numbers from a desk would blink. An elderly diabetic who had been stable for a week, gone in the small hours of a Tuesday, charted as cardiac arrest, expected, signed off. A post-surgical patient, recovering well, declining all afternoon and dead by dawn, charted as a complication of his original condition, a woman with pneumonia responding to treatment who simply stopped responding. Each one, taken alone, was the kind of thing that happened in a hospital that served the poorest and sickest part of a poor and sick city. Old people died, sick people died. That was the arithmetic of the place, and Maren had made her peace with it years ago. But she noticed things, and what she had started to notice, the thing that kept her standing at the chart station at 4 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee going colder, was that these particular deaths had a shape. They came on certain nights, they came to certain kinds of patients, and every one of them had, in the day or two before, a quiet change in a medication or a supply or a routine that nobody had announced and nobody could quite explain. She had not said any of this out loud. She had no proof, only a pattern, and she knew exactly what happened to a night nurse who walked into administration with a feeling and an accusation. So she did what she had always done. She watched. She wrote things down, small and private, in a notebook she kept in her bag. She waited for the pattern to show her one more piece of itself. And then, on a Thursday in the 3rd week of October, the hospital hired a new medical director, and the man walked on to 4 East on his second night like he was inspecting a battlefield he had already won. Howard Pace was 50, silver-haired, tailored even at midnight, the kind of man who used the word optimization the way other people use the word weather. He had come from a chain of profitable suburban hospitals with a reputation for turning red ink black, and the board had hired him to do exactly that to St. Brennan Mercy, and he carried that mandate into every room like a flag. On his second night, he toured the unit at 1 in the morning, trailed by 2 assistants and the charge nurse, and he stopped at the bed of the old man in 3, Mr. Delgado, who had pulled through his stroke and was fighting his way back, slow and stubborn, with Maren checking on him every hour. Pace looked at the monitor, looked at the chart on the tablet, and said to the air that this was exactly the sort of resource allocation the hospital could no longer justify. Maren, adjusting Mr. Delgado's oxygen, said quietly that the patient was improving and that another week would likely see him discharged home to his daughter. Pace turned and looked at her as though a piece of equipment had spoken. He asked her credentials. She told him, registered nurse, 15 years. He smiled the way men like him smiled, with everything but his eyes, and he said the line that would echo through everything that came after, "You're just a night nurse. Stay in your lane." And the ward went still. Mr. Delgado's monitor beeped its steady, stubborn rhythm into the silence. One of the assistants studied the floor. The charge nurse, a decent woman named Fay who had 30 years in and 2 years to retirement and a mortgage she could not afford to lose, said nothing, and the not saying anything was its own kind of answer, and Maren understood it completely and did not hold it against her. Maren let the breath out. She did not raise her voice. She did not list the things she could have listed. She simply said, "Yes, Director," and went back to her patient and turned the oxygen up a quarter liter because that was the next necessary thing, and her thumb found the worn edge of the brass coin in her pocket the way a hand finds a railing in the dark. Pace moved on down the hall, his voice already rising about some other inefficiency, and Maren stood in the small, bright pool of Mr. Delgado's bedside lamp and let the old anger go cold and useful inside her, the way she had been trained to, in a place she never talked about, by men who were mostly dead now. She had been called worse, in worse places, by people with actual rank. What she could not let go of, what stayed lit in her like a pilot light all the rest of that long night, was the number on the chart she had pulled an hour before he arrived. Because that afternoon, while she slept before her shift, a supply order had quietly gone through changing the unit stock of one particular medication from the brand the pharmacy had always used to a cheaper compounded version from a vendor she had never heard of. and the 3 patients who had died on her unit in the past 2 months had every one, received that exact class of drug in the night. She did not know yet that the man who had just told her to stay in her lane was the one who had signed the order. She only knew that the pattern had just shown her one more piece of itself, and that she was, as far as she could tell, the only person in the building who was looking. By morning, the hospital had forgotten the moment on 4 East, the way hospitals forget everything that does not bleed. Howard Pace went home and slept. Faye finished her shift and drove home with her hands tight on the wheel and did not tell her husband. The day staff came on and the night staff went off, and the great indifferent machine of the place turned over into another day exactly as if nothing had happened, because as far as the machine was concerned, nothing had. Maren Cole did not go home. She stayed 40 minutes past the end of her shift, sitting in her car in the staff lot with the engine off and the windows fogging, and she opened the small notebook she kept in her bag, the one with the cheap cardboard cover, and she wrote down 3 things. She wrote the name of the new compounded medication. She wrote the name of the vendor, which she had memorized off the supply tablet in the 4 seconds Pace's assistant had it open, and she wrote the names of the 3 patients with their dates in her small square hand, the same hand she had once used to write casualty tags in conditions where a smeared word could mean a man got the wrong dose. Then she sat for a while with the coin in her palm. It was an ordinary-looking thing to anyone who did not know what it was. A brass disc the size of a silver dollar, worn nearly smooth with the faint raised outline of a lantern on one face and a number on the other, 3 over FSD, almost rubbed away by a decade of being carried, a challenge coin, her unit's coin, the 3rd Forward Surgical Detachment, the one the men had nicknamed the Iron Wards because of where they set up and what they held. She had been their nurse, more than their nurse, at the end. She turned it over in her fingers, lantern, number, and she thought about the thing she had spent 11 years not thinking about, which was that she had been good at this, the keeping people alive, good in a way that had cost her something she could not get back and had earned her something she had never once worn. There was a box at the bottom of her closet at home. In the box was a ribbon, blue with a thin band of silver through the center, and a citation on heavy paper with a general signature at the bottom, and a small heavy cross that the country gave to people who did certain things under fire and lived. She had not opened the box in 3 years. She had taken the coin out of it once, the day she started at St. Brennan, and put it in her pocket, and that was as much of that life as she had been willing to carry into this one. She was not ashamed of it. It was simply that the woman who had earned those things and the woman who turned Mr. Delgado every 2 hours so his skin would not break down were the same woman trying to be only one person, and the seam between them was the most private thing she owned. She put the coin back in her pocket. She started the car. She drove home to a small apartment with a cat and a single chair by the window, and she slept the thin daylight sleep of people who work nights, and she dreamed, as she sometimes did, of a road in another country and a sound like the sky tearing, and she woke at 2 in the afternoon with her heart going and her hands, for just a moment, not quite steady. Then she made coffee, and they steadied, and she went back to work that night the way she went back every night, which was the only way she knew how to do anything, which was completely. To understand what Maren Cole was, you have to understand where the steadiness came from, because steadiness like that is not a personality, it is a scar. She had enlisted young, out of a town with no work, and a father who drank, and she had found in the structure of service the thing her childhood had never given her, which was the certainty that if you did the work correctly, the work would hold. She had trained as a medic, and then, because she was good, and because she could not stop herself from being good, as a trauma nurse, and then the detachment had pulled her because they needed someone who did not freeze, and she had gone to the place she did not talk about, and there she had learned the one lesson that underwrote everything she had become. The lesson was this: that in the moment when everything comes apart, when the credentialed and the confident and the loud all discover at once that they do not know what to do, there is almost always one person in the room who keeps moving, who does the next necessary thing, and then the next one after that, and that person is rarely the one with the most rank. It is the one who has decided in advance, in the cold private place where such decisions get made, that they will not stop. She had decided that a long time ago. She had held to it through a night the official record described in language that meant nothing, and the men who were there described not at all, because some things you carry instead of speaking. And she had come home and taken off the uniform and put the cross in a box and become, on purpose, the most unremarkable woman on the fourth floor of a hospital the city had forgotten, because she had wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to be somewhere quiet, somewhere the worst thing that happened was an old man's slow, brave recovery, somewhere she would never again have to be the one person in the room who did not stop. And now the pattern in the charts was telling her that the quiet place was not quiet, that something was reaching into 4 East in the dark and taking people who should have lived, and that the loud, confident man in the tailored suit either could not see it or did not want to, and Maren Cole stood at the chart station at 4 in the morning with the coin warm in her pocket and felt the old decision come awake inside her like a coal someone had blown on, and she was afraid, genuinely afraid, not of the danger but of what it would cost her to stop being unremarkable. She knew where it would lead. She had seen what happened to people who saw the thing no one else would look at. But she had also seen what happened to the people in the beds when no one looked at all. Over the next week, she did the patient thing, the careful thing, the thing that would have taken anyone else months and took her days because she knew how to look. She volunteered for the medication audits no one wanted. She memorized lot numbers. She noticed that the new compounded drug came in vials that were almost but not quite identical to the old ones, the label a half shade off, the cap a slightly different texture under her thumb, and she noticed that the concentration printed on the label did not match what the patient's responses suggested they were actually receiving. A blood thinner that was not thinning blood the way it should, a cardiac drug that seemed, in the bodies of the people it was given to be doing too little, or sometimes, terrifyingly, too much. She could not prove it from a label, but she could see it in the patients, because she had spent her whole life reading bodies the way other people read print, and the bodies were telling her that the medication coming up from the pharmacy in the night was not what it claimed to be. She did not let herself think often about the night that had made her able to read bodies that way, but it came back to her now in the small hours, the way the worst things come back when you are tired and the building is quiet. There had been a road and a convoy, and then there had not been a convoy, only fire and the sound of the sky tearing, and men down in the dust who an hour before had been showing her pictures of their kids. The credentialed people, the ones with the training and the rank, some of them had frozen, and some of them had been hit, and there had come a moment, a single clear cold moment, when she had understood that there was no one else, that the next 30 seconds belonged to her or to no one, and she had knelt in the dirt with a headlamp because the light was gone, and she had started doing the next necessary thing. She had worked through the night, she had run out of supplies and improvised the things you improvise when you have run out, tourniquets from straps, an airway from a tube that was meant for something else, pressure held by her own knee while her hands did 3 other jobs. 11 of them came in through that night under her hands, and 11 of them were still breathing when the light came up, and the last one she reached, the one nearly gone, the major with the chest wound and the eyes already going far away. She had pulled back from the edge by refusing to let him go, talking to him the whole time, telling him to hold on, that she had him, that she was not going to let go until the words themselves seemed to be the thing keeping him tethered. The men started calling her Lantern after that, because she was the one who came in the dark, and the light came with her, and the name had followed her through the rest of the deployment and onto a citation she never read and into a box at the bottom of a closet. She had not wanted it. She had wanted only to forget the dust and the weight of a man's life held in two tired hands. But you do not forget the thing you are. You only put it down for a while. And standing at the chart station 11 years later with the coin warm in her pocket and the wrong medication coming up from the pharmacy, Maren Cole felt the weight settle back into her hands as though it had never left, and she understood that the quiet years had been a held breath and that she was about to let it out. The first patient she nearly lost to it was a retired school teacher named Mrs. Okonkwo, a small, fierce woman in bed 5 who had come in with a clot in her leg and should have been an easy week. Maren had taken to checking her more often than the orders called for because the school teacher fit the profile, the kind of patient the pattern liked: elderly, stable, easy to chart as expected if she slipped away in the night. On the fourth night, the school teacher's leg began, quietly, to swell again, and her oxygen began, by degrees so small no automatic alarm would catch them, to drift down, and the chart said she had received a full dose of the blood thinner that should have been holding the clot at bay. Moran read the body instead of the chart. She read the swelling and the faint blue tinge at the lips and the particular restlessness of a person whose blood is doing something it should not. And she understood that the clot was growing, that a piece of it could break loose and travel to the lungs at any moment, that the medication charted into this woman had not done its work because the medication charted into this woman was not what the label said. She did not wait for the resident, who was asleep in the call room, and would, she knew, defer to the chart over the night nurse. She did the next necessary thing. She raised the head of the bed, started oxygen, and called the resident anyway. And when he came, bleary and skeptical, and looked at the chart and said the patient had been adequately anticoagulated, and Nurse Cole was perhaps overreacting, Moran said in her flat, factual voice, 4 words that she knew would either save the woman or end her career a little faster. She said, "Order a stat ultrasound." The resident hesitated, annoyed, and then, because something in the way she said it reached past his fatigue, he ordered it, and the ultrasound showed the clot extending exactly where Maren had said it would be, and they treated it correctly with the real medication from the locked emergency stock. The brand name vials Marian made sure to pull herself, and Mrs. Okonkwo lived to be discharged home to her grandchildren the following week, never knowing how close she had come. The resident did not thank her. He filed instead a quiet note about a nurse who had been difficult and demanding, which would later appear in the file Pace used against her. But Maren did not do it for thanks. She did it because the school teacher was in the bed, and the school teacher came first, and because the near miss had told her something she needed to know, which was that the pattern was not slowing down, that it was, if anything, accelerating, and that she was running out of time to do this the patient, careful way. She started keeping 2 vials back each shift, the way you are absolutely not supposed to, slipping them into a small cooler in her bag, because somewhere underneath the fear, a part of her that had once written casualty tags knew exactly what the word was for what she was building. She was building a chain of evidence, and on the 8th night, while she was doing it, Howard Pace caught her at the medication cabinet with a vial in her hand that was not yet logged, and his face did something she would think about later, a flicker of something that was not anger but closer to fear before the anger arrived to cover it. He asked her what she was doing. She said she was checking a lot number. He took the vial from her hand, read the label, and told her very quietly now that there had been concerns about her, that some of the staff found her difficult, that perhaps she had been on nights too long, and then he said that he was placing her under review, and that until the review was complete, she was to keep, and here he used the word again, in her lane. He walked away with the vial in his pocket, and Maren stood in the white light of the open cabinet and understood three things at once. She understood that he knew. She understood that he was not the top of it, because men at the top do not sign supply orders or pocket evidence themselves. And she understood, with a calm that surprised her, that she had just become a problem that a man like that would need to make disappear, and that the only protection she had was the cooler in her bag, and the notebook with the cardboard cover, and the 11 years of training that had taught her how to keep going after the moment everyone else stopped. She did not sleep that day. She sat in her chair by the window with the cat in her lap and the coin in her hand, and she made the decision again, the way she had made it before, in the cold, private place, and then she drove back to work, into whatever was coming, because that was the next necessary thing, and because there were people in those beds, and because she had never in her life learned how to stay in her lane when the lane led straight past someone who was dying. The review changed things, the way these things are designed to. Overnight, Maren Cole went from invisible to watched, which is a particular cruelty in a workplace because the watching is never about safety and always about isolation. Pace did it cleanly. He did not fire her because firing her would have required a reason on paper, and a reason on paper could be challenged. Instead, he let it be known, in the soft administrative way that travels faster than any memo, that Nurse Cole was under review, that her judgment was in question, that the prudent thing was distance. He reassigned her to the far end of the unit, the 4 beds by the stairwell where the sickest long-term patients went, the ones the staff privately called the quiet rooms because so few of their occupants ever talked back. He gave her the heaviest assignment and the least help. He scheduled her opposite Faye, so the one nurse with the seniority to protect her was never on at the same time, and he made sure in a dozen small ways that the rest of the night staff understood that to be seen helping Maren Cole was to catch a little of whatever she had. Most of them complied, not because they were cruel, but because they were tired and afraid and a paycheck away from disaster, every one of them, and Maren understood this so completely that she could not even summon resentment for it. She had served with people who broke under far less. She knew that courage was not a thing most people had lying around. It was a thing you built, in advance, in the quiet, and almost no one was given the time. So she took the quiet rooms and the heavy load and the cold shoulders without complaint, and she did the work, and she watched, and she kept her cooler and her notebook, and she waited for the pattern to make its next move, which she now knew it would, because she had taken away its anonymity, and a thing like that does not simply stop. There was one person who did not turn away. Her name was Priya Nandakumar, and she was 24 years old and 11 weeks out of nursing school, and she had been put on nights because new grads always got nights, and she was drowning quietly, the way new nurses drown, behind a face she worked very hard to keep calm. On her 3rd shift she had made an error, a small one, a decimal in the wrong place that she caught herself, but not before the catching of it left her shaking in the med room, and Maren had found her there and had not reported it and had not lectured her. Maren had simply shown her a trick, an old field trick, for checking a dose 3 ways in the time it took to draw it up, and had stayed with her, unhurried, until the girl's hands were steady. From that night, Priya had attached herself to Maren the way the young attach themselves to anyone who makes the terror survivable, and when the order came down that Nurse Cole was under review and best avoided, Priya Nandakumar had looked around at the nurses suddenly very busy with their charts and had made a different decision. She kept helping. She brought Maren coffee. She took the beds nearest the quiet rooms so she would be close. She did not say anything brave or declare any loyalty because she did not have the words for it yet. She just did not turn away, and to Maren, who had once led people through the worst night of their lives and had learned exactly what that simple refusal to turn away was worth, it was everything. Priya became the early sign, the way there is always an early sign. She was the one who first noticed on her own that something was wrong with the numbers because Maren had taught her to read bodies and the girl had a gift for it. She came to Maren one night, frightened, and said that a patient in the quiet rooms, a retired bus driver recovering from a clot, had a clotting time that did not make sense given the dose he was charted as receiving, and she did not understand it, and was she doing something wrong? Maren looked at the chart and looked at the vial, and felt the coin go warm in her pocket, and told the girl very gently that she was not doing anything wrong, that she had in fact just done something exactly right, and that she should not, under any circumstances, tell anyone else what she had noticed. The girl's eyes went wide and she understood, the way the young understand things faster than we give them credit for, that she had just stepped over a line into something dangerous, and she squared her small shoulders and said, "Okay," and Maren felt a pang she had not felt in 11 years, the particular fear of being responsible for someone younger in a situation that could hurt them. She had felt it last on a road in another country with a 19-year-old private bleeding under her hands. She pushed the memory down. She did the next necessary thing, and the next necessary thing that night was to realize that she could no longer wait for the pattern, because the retired bus driver in the quiet rooms, the one whose numbers did not make sense, was exactly the profile, and if she did nothing, he would be dead by the weekend, charted as expected, signed off, gone the way the other three had gone. So Maren did something she had not done in 11 years. She broke the rule that had governed the back half of her life. She let herself be seen, not all the way. She did not announce who she was, but she went over Pace's head, carefully, to the one channel administration could not easily make disappear, which was the hospital's patient safety hotline, an anonymous line the accreditation board required every hospital to maintain, and most hospitals quietly hoped no one would ever use. She called it at 4 a.m. from the stairwell, her voice flat and factual, and she reported a suspected medication discrepancy on 4 East, with lot numbers, with dates, with the specific clinical findings, in the clipped, precise language of someone who had filed reports under conditions the person on the other end could not have imagined. She did not give her name. She gave the facts, and then she went back to the bus driver and adjusted his care within every authority she actually had, monitoring him more closely than the orders required, catching with her own attention the thing the bad medication was failing to do, and she kept him alive through the night by sheer vigilance, the way she had once kept men alive by sheer vigilance. And when the day shift came on, he was stable, and she drove home shaking and did not sleep. She thought the hotline would do something. She was wrong about how the system worked, or rather, she was right about how it was supposed to work, and wrong about how it actually did, which is a distinction the powerless learn and the powerful never have to, because the patient safety report, routed through the proper channels, landed 2 days later on the desk of the very man it was about. Howard Pace read the anonymous complaint about a medication discrepancy on 4 East, complete with lot numbers only a handful of people could have known, and he did not need a name. He knew, and this time there was no flicker of fear, or if there was, he had buried it deeper, because now he moved with the cold efficiency of a man protecting something much larger than himself. He pulled the bus driver's chart and quietly changed an order. He scheduled Maren for a mandatory fitness for duty evaluation, the bureaucratic instrument by which inconvenient employees are declared unwell. And he made one phone call to a number that did not belong to anyone at St. Brennan Mercy to report that the problem on 4 East had a face and a name, and to ask what should be done about it. Maren did not know about the phone call, But she knew when she came in the next night and found the bus driver's orders changed and her own name on an evaluation she had not requested, that the line had not protected her, that it had instead handed her straight to the thing she was fighting, and that she was now alone in a building with a man who had decided she was a threat, with patients in the beds who would die if she stopped, and with 11 years of training and a brass coin and a cooler full of evidence she did not yet have any safe way to use. She stood at the chart station in the 4 a.m. quiet. She touched the coin, and somewhere under the fear, the old self, the one with the call sign, the one the men had trusted with the worst night of their lives, woke all the way up and looked at the situation with cold, clear eyes and began, methodically, to plan. What the official record would later call an isolated supply irregularity began for Maren Cole at 2:14 in the morning on a Saturday, when the power to the east wing of St. Brennan Mercy died and did not come back the way it was supposed to. Later, there would be an explanation, a failed transfer switch, an aging generator that carried the emergency circuits but not the full load, a maintenance contract that had been cut 2 budgets ago. At 2:14 in the morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the overhead lights on 4 East dropped to the dim red of emergency power, that half the monitors went dark and then rebooted with their alarms disabled, that the medication pumps on a dozen patients stopped and beeped and waited for hands that were not there, and that the unit, already running on 6 nurses where it needed 10, suddenly became a place where the difference between living and dying was measured in how fast a small number of people could move in the dark. Maren was at the far end in the quiet rooms when the lights dropped. She did not freeze. The freezing is the thing, the universal thing, the half-second or the half-minute in which a normal person's mind refuses the new reality and waits for someone to tell them it is not happening, and Maren Cole did not have it, had trained it out of herself in a place where the half-second was the difference. And so, while the rest of the unit stood blinking in the red light, she was already moving, already counting, already triaging in her head the way you triage when there is not enough of anything to go around. She knew where every patient was. She knew which ones were stable and which ones were a stopped pump away from death. She crossed to the bus driver first because his clotting was the thing she had been watching, and found his pump dark and restarted it on the backup battery she had quietly charged and stashed 3 nights before because she had seen the generator logs and known this was coming because she noticed things. Then she did the thing that turned the night, the thing that the staff who survived it would describe for years afterward without ever quite being able to explain. She took command, not officially. No one gave her the authority. She simply began, in a voice that was not loud but carried, in a voice that had given orders under fire to tell people what to do, and the remarkable thing, the thing about authority that men like Howard Pace never understand, is that in the moment of true crisis, people do not follow rank. They follow competence. They follow the one person who is not afraid, who knows what comes next, who turns the formless terror into a list of tasks a frightened person can actually do. Maren gave Priya the 3 most stable patients and a flashlight and exact instructions, and watched the girl steady under the weight of being useful. She sent the float nurse for the manual resuscitation bags. She put Faye, who was not on that night but who lived close and whom Maren had called at 2:16 from the stairwell phone, with 4 flat words, on a path toward the unit. She handled the unstable patients herself, moving from bed to bed in the red dark with a headlamp she produced from her bag, an actual headlamp, and the staff who saw it would remember that detail above all the others. The night nurse, with a soldier's headlamp, calmly doing in the dark what they could barely do in the light. A patient in bed 7, an elderly woman with pneumonia, went into respiratory distress when her oxygen concentrator failed, and Maren was there, bagging her by hand, counting the breaths aloud in a steady rhythm, her own pulse slow, her hands sure, until the backup oxygen came online. A man in 11, post-cardiac, threw a lethal rhythm when his monitor rebooted, and Maren read it off the screen in the half-second the trace appeared, called it before the machine could, and had the crash cart there and the pads on his chest and the rhythm converted in a span of time that the day shift, hearing about it later, would refuse to believe. And then, just as it seemed the worst had passed, the second wave came, the way the second wave always comes, because crises are never one thing. The float nurse came running from the far hall, white-faced, to say that a diabetic patient in 14 had gone unresponsive, blood sugar crashing, and at almost the same moment the woman in 7 that Maren had just stabilized began to seize, and there were now 2 patients dying at opposite ends of the dark unit, and one nurse who could read both situations at once. A lesser nurse would have frozen on the choice. Maren did not choose, she sequenced. She sent Priya to the diabetic with exact instructions for the rescue glucose, talking her through it from across the unit in a voice that never rose, trusting the girl she had trained, and she took the seizing woman herself, turning her, protecting her airway, timing the seizure aloud, and she held both lives in her hands at once across the length of a blacked-out ward and did not drop either one. She did not stop. She did the next necessary thing and then the one after that, for 17 minutes that felt like 17 years, and contained, by the count someone did afterward, 8 separate moments in which a patient would have died without an intervention that only she, in that unit, on that night, in that dark, was able to provide. 8. The same number, almost, as the worst night of her other life, and somewhere in the middle of it, bagging the woman in 7 with her hands moving on their own and her mind utterly clear, Maren Cole understood that she had not escaped that night at all, that you do not escape the thing you are, that she had simply been waiting all 4 of these quiet years for the dark to come back so she could find out if she was still the person who did not stop. She was, and Howard Pace, who arrived on the unit at minute 9, drawn by the alarms and the chaos, stood in the doorway in his tailored suit with the red light on his silver hair, and watched the night nurse he had ordered to stay in her lane run a mass casualty event in the dark with the calm of a person to whom this was, somehow, familiar. And for the first time the flicker of fear on his face was not about being caught. It was about her. It was the dawning animal recognition that he had badly, dangerously misjudged the woman in the plain blue scrubs, and that whatever he thought he knew about who held power on 4 East was wrong. He opened his mouth to assert himself, to take command, to do the thing his rank entitled him to do, and Maren, without looking up from the woman she was keeping alive, said one sentence to him, flat and quiet and absolutely without deference. "If you're not going to help, get out of the doorway." And he did. He stepped back. The director of the hospital stepped back into the hall and let the night nurse work, because in that moment the truth of the room was louder than any title, and everyone in it, including him, including her, knew exactly who was in command. When the lights came back at 2:31, full and white and sudden, they came up on a unit that should have lost half its patients and had lost none, on nurses standing in the wreckage of the worst 17 minutes of their careers, on Priya Nandakumar, with tears running silently down her face, and her 3 patients alive, and the diabetic in 14 awake and confused and breathing, and on Maren Cole, headlamp pushed up on her forehead, hands finally slightly beginning to shake, standing at the foot of bed 7 where the woman with pneumonia was breathing on her own. No one spoke for a moment, and then Faye, who had run the last 2 blocks and arrived at minute 14 and seen most of it, said into the silence in a voice full of something between awe and accusation, The question that everyone on 4 East was suddenly thinking. The question that would not now go away. The question that was the first crack in 11 years of carefully kept quiet. She said, "Maren, where in God's name did you learn to do that?" Maren did not answer Faye's question. She said the woman in 7 needed a chest film, and the man in 11 needed a 12 lead, and that someone should check whether the medication fridge had stayed cold through the outage, and she turned the moment back into a list of tasks because that was how she protected the thing she was not ready to give up, and because there were still patients, and the patients came first, the way they always came first. But the question did not go away. You cannot do what she had done in front of 8 witnesses and have it slide back under the surface. By the end of that shift, the story had moved through the hospital the way the best stories move, hand to hand, in low voices, growing as it went. The night nurse who took command in the dark, the headlamp, the rhythm she called before the monitor, the 8 patients who should have died. The day staff came on and heard it and looked at the quiet woman in the soft blue scrubs with new eyes, and some of the looks were wonder, and some of them were the wary, recalculating looks people give you when they realize you are not what they had filed you as. And Howard Pace, who had stepped back into the hallway, who had been told to get out of the doorway by a night nurse and had obeyed, went home that morning not relieved that his patients had lived but afraid, because a woman who could do that was a woman who could see what he had done, and a witness like that could not be managed with a review and an evaluation. So he escalated, and in escalating he made his first real mistake. He decided that the supply irregularity, the thing she had been documenting, needed to be cleaned up before anyone with authority started asking why 8 patients had nearly died in a unit that had been quietly losing people for months. He came in himself the next night on Maren's shift, ostensibly to inspect the unit after the outage, actually to get into the medication room and the records, and he made the mistake of doing it while she was watching, because he still, even now, did not entirely believe that the woman in the plain scrubs was a real threat. He still thought of her as a night nurse who had gotten lucky in the dark. He went into the med room, he pulled vials, he accessed the supply records on the tablet, and Maren Cole, who had spent 11 years learning to observe without being observed, watched him do all of it from the chart station with the cold, patient attention of a person who had once watched an enemy position for 6 hours without moving, and she saw exactly which lots he pulled and exactly which records he opened, and she understood that he was not investigating the discrepancy. He was erasing it. That was the night the conspiracy showed Maren its real size, because as she watched Pace work, watched the practiced way he altered the supply log, watched him pocket the same compounded vials she had been collecting, she realized that this was not one corrupt director cutting corners. The vendor, the falsified concentrations, the pattern of deaths that reached back further than Pace's tenure, the smoothness of the cover, all of it was bigger than one man, and Pace was not the author of it but its instrument, a node in something that ran up out of the hospital into a structure she could not yet see. The cheap compounded drugs were coming from a vendor that was billing the hospital for the brand name product and pocketing the difference, and someone above Pace was taking a cut, and the patients who died were not being murdered, not exactly they were being allowed to die, sacrificed to a margin, their deaths charted as the ordinary arithmetic of a poor hospital, while someone somewhere counted the savings. It was, Maren understood, a perfect crime because it hid inside the thing everyone already expected, which was that poor sick people in underfunded hospitals died. No one would ever investigate the expected. That was the genius of it and the horror of it, and standing at the chart station watching the director quietly remove the evidence of it, Maren Cole felt the old cold clarity settle over her completely, the clarity of the worst night of her other life, the clarity that came when the situation was beyond outrage and had become simply a problem to be solved. She let him finish. She did not confront him because confrontation was what he expected and what he was prepared for, and she had not survived what she had survived by doing the expected thing. She let him take the vials and alter the log and leave, satisfied, thinking he had contained it. And then she did 3 things methodically in the small hours, with the unit quiet around her. First, she went into the records herself with her own credentials, and before he could lock her out, she copied, to a small drive she kept in her bag beside the coin, the supply logs as they had existed before his alterations, because she had pulled them an hour earlier on a hunch, and now she had the before and the after, the original and the lie, side by side. Second, she retrieved from the cooler in her bag the vials she had been collecting for 2 weeks, the real ones, the ones with the wrong concentrations, and she labeled each one in her small square hand with the date and the lot and the patient, building the physical chain of evidence that a copied log alone could never be, because she knew from a life of documentation under impossible conditions that the body of proof has to be both the record and the thing itself. And third, she did the hardest thing, the thing that cost her the most, the thing she had sworn 11 years ago she would never do again. She picked up the stairwell phone at 4 a.m. and she called a number she had not called in 3 years, a number that belonged to a man who had once been her commanding officer. And when the gruff, thick voice answered, she said 4 words that she had promised herself she would never say to him, 4 words that gave away all at once the seam she had spent a decade protecting. She said, "Sir, it's Lantern. I need help." There was a long silence on the line, the silence of a man waking all the way up, the silence of a name landing that he had not heard in years, and then the voice, no longer sleepy, said, "Lantern, my God, where are you, and who do I need to make disappear?" And Maren Cole, alone in a stairwell in a hospital the city had forgotten, with a drive full of stolen truth in her pocket, and a cooler full of evidence in her bag, and a brass coin warm in her hand, felt the seam between her 2 lives finally, after 11 years, begin to give way, and she did not know yet whether what came through it would save the patients or simply finish what Howard Pace had started. But she knew it was the next necessary thing, and so she had done it, the way she did everything, which was completely. The man on the phone was named Gus Riley, and 12 years ago he had been a colonel, and he had been Maren Cole's commanding officer in the 3rd Forward Surgical Detachment, the Iron Wards, and he had been the one who put her up for the cross she had never worn. He was retired now, ran a hardware store in a small town 2 states away, coached a girls' softball team, and had not, by his own account, slept properly since the night that had earned them both things they did not talk about. When Maren set her call sign into the stairwell phone, something old and dormant in Gus Riley came awake, the part of him that had once been responsible for keeping his people alive and had never fully let it go, and within an hour he had done 3 things that changed the shape of everything. He had pulled from the network of people who had served and now occupied quiet positions of consequence all over the country, the name of someone at the state health department who handled exactly this kind of thing and could not be reached by anyone Howard Pace knew. He had begun, carefully, the process of getting Maren's evidence into hands that the conspiracy could not buy or bury. And he had made one more call, a personal one, to an old friend, a man who had also served, a man who was at that very moment, by a coincidence that was not entirely a coincidence, a patient on the 4th floor of St. Brennan Mercy in room 9. Because here is the thing about the men Maren Cole had kept alive on the worst night of her other life. They had not forgotten her. You do not forget the person who knelt over you in the dark with the sky tearing apart and refused to let you die. They had carried her, the way she carried the coin, all the years since, and they had wondered what became of her, and some of them had looked quietly over the years and had never found her because she had made herself very hard to find. The man in room 9 had looked the hardest of all. His name was Ezra Vandermeer, and on the worst night of Maren Cole's other life, he had been a major, badly wounded command of a position that was being overrun, and Maren had reached him last when there was almost nothing left to work with, and had kept him alive across a distance and through a span of time that the citation she never read had described as extraordinary. He had risen, in the years after, to General 2 stars, a career built on the second life she had bought him in the dark, and he had retired with honor and come home, and 3 weeks ago a failing heart had put him in the only hospital his insurance and his stubbornness would agree on, which happened to be St. Brennan Mercy on 4 East in the quiet rooms, in room 9, 2 doors down from where a night nurse he would not have recognized was being told to stay in her lane. He had been there the whole time. He had been one of the patients she moved among in the red dark during the outage, though she had been too deep in the work to see his face, and he had watched her, from his bed, bag a dying woman by hand with a headlamp on her forehead, and something in the way she moved, the calm, the economy, the particular way she counted breaths aloud, had reached into the oldest part of his memory and rung a bell he could not place. He had spent the days since trying to place it, and now, at 6 in the morning, Gus Riley's phone call placed it for him. Gus did not say much. He did not have to. He said an old friend of theirs was working as a nurse at Vandermeer's hospital, that she was in trouble, that her call sign was Lantern, and the line went quiet, and then Ezra Vandermeer, retired general, 2 stars, said in a voice that shook for the first time in years, "Lantern is alive. Lantern is here." And he understood all at once that the night nurse with the headlamp, the one who had kept him and 7 others breathing through the dark, the one some director had ordered out of a doorway, was the woman who had knelt over him a continent and a lifetime ago and told him, when he was certain he was dying, in a voice he had never forgotten, to hold on, that she had him, that she was not going to let go. He had spent 11 years wanting to find her, to thank her, to give her back some fraction of what she had given him, and she had been 2 doors down the whole time, emptying his trash and checking his oxygen, and not once telling him who she was. That was the day the reveal began, though it did not happen all at once, because the real reveals never do. They happen in stages, each one inverting a little more of what the room believed. The first stage was small and private. Maren came in that night not knowing about any of it, not knowing Gus had called Vandermeer, not knowing the general in room 9 was the major from the road, because she did not let herself look too closely at the faces of veterans. It cost too much. She came in to find the unit tense, pace prowling, the evaluation she had been ordered to attend scheduled for the following morning, the noose, in bureaucratic terms, tightening. She did her rounds, and when she came to room 9, the old man who was always polite and never any trouble, the retired general whose chart she knew and whose history she had never connected to her own, was awake, sitting up, watching the door. And as she came in with his evening medications, he looked at her, really looked at her, in the full light now, not the red dark of the outage, and Maren felt the look, the particular weight of being recognized, and her hands went still on the medication tray. The old man's eyes filled. He did not salute, not then. He was too weak to stand, and the moment was too large for it. He simply looked at her for a long time, and then he said very quietly, in a voice worn thin by the failing heart, but absolutely certain, the name she had not heard spoken aloud in 3 years, the name from the other life, the name the men had given her because she was the one who came in the dark, and the light came with her. He said, "Lantern," and Maren Cole, who had not flinched when a director shamed her in front of the whole ward, who had not flinched in the red dark with 8 lives in her hands, stood in the doorway of room 9 with a tray of evening medications and felt something go through her that she had spent 11 years building walls against, and the walls did not hold. And for just a moment, the first moment in 11 years, the night nurse and the captain were one person, standing in the light, fully seen. She did not say anything. She could not. She set down the tray, and the old man reached out one trembling hand, not to be helped, but to take hers, the way the living take the hand of the person who refused to let them die. And he held it, and the two of them stayed like that in the quiet room while the indifferent machine of the hospital turned over in the hall outside. Two people who had been to the same place on the same night and carried it alone for 11 years and had just against every odd, found each other in a forgotten hospital on the wrong side of a river. Outside the room, the conspiracy ground on. The evaluation was scheduled. Pace was erasing. The vendor was billing. Somewhere above all of it, the unseen author counted the margin. None of that had changed. But something had changed in the room, and it would change everything, because the night nurse the system had isolated was no longer alone, and the general in room 9 was not a man who had ever, in his life, watched a system kill the people it was supposed to protect and done nothing, and he had just been handed, by a hardware store owner, 2 states away, both the reason and the means to do something about it. He let go of her hand. He told her to come back when her shift was done, that there were things he needed to say and things she needed to know. And Maren, who had a drive full of evidence and a cooler full of vials and an evaluation in the morning designed to end her, looked at the old soldier she had saved without knowing she was saving him again, and understood that the reckoning she had been building toward alone was about to stop being something she did alone, and she went back to her rounds, and her hands, when she drew up the next patient's medication, were perfectly steady. What the general told her, in the small hours after her shift, was the part of the story she had not been able to see from inside it. Ezra Vandermeer had not been idle in his hospital bed. A man does not rise to 2 stars without learning how power actually moves, and he had spent his 3 weeks on 4 East doing what he had always done, which was watch and listen and understand the terrain, and what he had understood well before he knew the night nurse's name was that something was wrong with the place. He had noticed, the way Maren had noticed, that patients in the quiet rooms had a way of not making it. He had noticed the new director's particular interest in the medication room. He had noticed, because he had spent a career reading men, that Howard Pace had the smooth, nervous quality of a man managing a secret. And he had quietly, from his bed, with the phone his granddaughter had set up for him, begun to make inquiries of his own, calling in a favor here and a favor there, the slow, careful way an old soldier builds a picture, so that when Gus Riley's call came and the night nurse turned out to be Lantern, Vandermeer was not starting from nothing. He was most of the way to the truth already, and Maren's evidence was the piece that made the picture whole. They put it together that night, the two of them, in the quiet of room 9, the general and the nurse, the way they had once worked together without knowing it, each supplying what the other lacked. Maren had the clinical proof, the vials, the altered logs, the pattern of deaths read correctly for the first time. Vandermeer had the institutional reach, the names, the understanding of how the money moved, and between them the shape of the thing finally stood clear, and it was worse than either had known alone. The compounding vendor was a shell, owned through 2 intermediaries by a holding company, and the holding company's board included a man who also sat on the board of St. Brennan Mercy, a man who had championed Howard Pace's hiring, a man whose name appeared on the hospital's most generous donor list, and on the masthead of a foundation that funded exactly the kind of underfunded county hospitals where deaths went uninvestigated and margins went unwatched. The pattern was not local. The same vendor served a dozen hospitals in 3 states, all of them poor, all of them quiet, all of them places where the death of a sick old person on a Tuesday night raised no questions at all. The scale of it, when Maren finally saw it, took even her breath, because she had been fighting what she thought was one cruel director and had stumbled instead onto something that had been killing the forgotten, quietly, by the margin, for years, in the dark, where no one looked. The general put it most plainly, in the worn, flat voice of a man who had spent a career sending people into harm and accounting for what came back. He said that he had seen this exact shape before, not in a hospital but in a supply chain a long way from home, where someone far from the danger had decided that a number on a spreadsheet was worth more than the people the number stood for, and that the thing about that kind of evil was that it never looked like evil from the inside. It looked like prudence, like responsibility, like a difficult decision made by serious men in a quiet room. He said the men in the quiet room never saw the bodies, they saw the savings, and the only way you ever beat them, he said, was to put the bodies and the savings on the same page where everyone could see them at once, so that no one could pretend any longer that the two things were not connected. Maren listened, and she understood that this was the same lesson she had learned in the dust, said in a different language, the lesson that systems protect themselves and only people save people, and she understood that she and this dying old man had arrived at the same hard truth by the same hard road, 11 years and a continent apart, and that this was why he had recognized her in the dark before he knew her name, because they were, underneath the rank and the scrubs, the same kind of person, the kind who does not look away. And here the story could have curdled, the way these stories curdle, into rage and ruin, into a confrontation in a hallway, into the kind of clean, violent vengeance that feels satisfying for a moment and changes nothing. Maren Cole had it in her to do that. She had it in her, more than most, and the old self, the captain, the one who had once done hard things in the dark, looked at the man who had let her patients die for a margin and felt the pull of it. But that was not who she was, not any more, not at her best, and it was not what would save anyone. The patients in the beds did not need a martyr or an avenger. They needed the lie to stop and the truth to surface in a way the system could not bury, and that required not violence but documentation, not a confrontation but a chain of custody, not rage but the cold patient discipline that had always been her real weapon. So that is what they built. Over the next 4 days, while Pace tightened his bureaucratic noose and the evaluation came, and Maren sat through it with flat, unreadable composure and gave them nothing to use, she and Vandermeer and Gus Riley, 2 states away, assembled, piece by piece, a case. The vials went, through a chain of hands the conspiracy could not see, to an independent lab that confirmed in cold scientific language what Maren had read in the bodies of her patients, that the compounded drugs were subpotent and mislabeled, that the concentrations did not match the labels, that patients receiving them had been getting a fraction of the medication their charts claimed. The copied logs, the before and the after, went to the contact at the state health department that Gus had found, a woman who had spent her career trying to catch exactly this and never having the proof, and who recognized, the moment she saw Maren's documentation, that she had finally been handed a case that would hold. And the pattern of deaths, correlated now with the lot numbers and the dates and the altered records, went where patterns of deaths go when someone finally insists on looking, which is to the kind of authority that can subpoena a holding company's books. There was a hard moment in the middle of those 4 days, the kind of moment that nearly undoes everything, when a senior physician named Dr. Iverson, a man with 30 years on the medical staff and a deep institutional loyalty to the place that had made his career, got wind that a night nurse was making noise about the medication supply, and decided, out of nothing crueler than a lifetime of believing the system mostly worked, to put a stop to it. He cornered Maren at the nurse's station in front of the day shift and told her, reasonably, condescendingly, that compounded medications were perfectly standard, that the death rate on a unit full of the elderly and the poor was exactly what statistics predicted, that she was seeing a conspiracy in ordinary tragedy, and that he intended to recommend her for the same fitness evaluation if she did not let it go. It would have been so easy then to argue, to raise her voice, to spread the accusation thin across a hallway full of people who would dismiss it. Maren did not. She had learned in the place she did not talk about that you do not waste a true thing on a person who has decided not to hear it. She said only that she understood his concern and that she had documented everything, and that the documentation would speak for itself in the proper forum, and she let him walk away thinking he had won, because letting him think so kept him from doing the one thing that could have hurt her, which was going to Pace. What Dr. Iverson did not know, what he would learn later and never quite forgive himself for, was that one of the patients in the pattern, a man he had personally pronounced and signed off as an expected cardiac death, had been receiving the subpotent cardiac drug, and that his own name was on that chart, and that the proof Maren had built so patiently included the record of his signature on a death that need not have happened. She did not throw that at him. She could have. She did not, because the man was not the enemy, only a failure of attention, and because the next necessary thing was the case, not the satisfaction. And the case kept building, quietly, vial by vial, name by name, while the conspiracy was not asleep, and the same 4 days that Maren spent building the case were the days Pace spent realizing, with growing alarm, that his containment had failed, that the night nurse he thought he had isolated was somehow still moving, and he began to hunt for the evidence he could feel slipping away from him. He had the building searched quietly under the cover of an inventory audit. He had her locker opened while she was off shift, finding nothing, because the cooler and the drive never left her bag, and the bag never left her side. He pulled the access logs to see who had been in the records, and saw her credentials there, and understood that she had copied something before he could lock her out, and the understanding made him desperate in a way that made him dangerous. On the third night, he made his move on her directly. He arranged, through the agency that staffed the unit, to have Maren reassigned mid-shift to a different floor, away from the quiet rooms, and away from room 9, and away, he thought, from whatever she was doing, and he stationed himself near the medroom to watch. But Maren had served with men who used reassignment as a weapon, and she had seen it coming the way she saw the outage coming, and she had already that afternoon moved the most critical piece of the evidence out of the building entirely, handing the cooler to Priya at the end of the previous shift with quiet instructions to take it to a refrigerated address Gus had arranged, so that when Pace finally got his search, the building was clean and the proof was already 2 states away in a courier's chain of custody. The reassignment, in the end, did Pace one disservice he never anticipated, because it took Maren off 4 East on the very night he had chosen to do his final cleanup of the records, and it meant that the one person who could have stopped him watching, the general in room 9, was alone and awake when Pace came through the unit at 2 in the morning to alter the last of the logs, and Ezra Vandermeer, lying still in his bed with his eyes half closed, watched the director of the hospital commit the cover-up with his own hands and remembered every second of it, because a man does not rise to 2 stars without learning how to be a witness. It took everything Maren had. She worked her shifts, kept her patients alive, sat through the evaluation, endured the isolation and the reassignment, and in the hours she should have slept she built the case with the general and the colonel, and the brass coin lived in her hand through all of it. Lantern and number, the worn reminder of who she had been and what she had survived, and the simple, unkillable fact that she did not stop. Pace, sensing the ground shifting under him without understanding how, grew reckless. He moved up her termination. He filed the evaluation's findings, doctored to suggest she was unfit. He came to the unit to deliver the news himself, to do the thing his rank entitled him to do, to remove the inconvenient night nurse from the building for good, and he chose to do it in front of the staff, in the corridor outside the quiet rooms, the same staff who had watched him shame her 3 weeks before, because men like Howard Pace do not learn, and because he wanted, on some level he would never admit, to win the moment he had started. He told her, loudly, that her employment was terminated effective immediately, that her judgment was unsound, that she was to gather her things and be escorted from the premises. He used one last time the word lane. And the corridor went still, the way it had gone still 3 weeks before, the staff looking at their shoes, the machine of the hospital turning over indifferently in the background. But this time the stillness was different, because this time there was a door open onto room 9, and in the doorway of room 9, standing, on legs that should not have held him, one hand braced on the frame, and the other slowly, deliberately rising, was a retired general the whole hospital knew was too sick to stand. And the corridor's attention turned to him the way a room's attention turns to the one impossible thing in it, and Howard Pace turned too, and watched with the first true fear of his life as Ezra Vandermeer brought his trembling hand to his brow in a salute that he held and held and held, fixed on the night nurse in the plain blue scrubs, and said in a voice that the failing heart could barely power, but that carried down the length of that corridor like a command, "In my hospital, Director, you will not speak to this officer that way again." The word officer landed in the corridor like a stone in still water, and the rings of it moved out through the gathered staff and changed the meaning of everything they thought they had been watching. For a moment no one understood, and then the old man, still saluting, still upright on legs that visibly shook with the effort, began in that thin, powerful voice to explain, not to Maren, who already knew, but to the room, to the staff, to Howard Pace standing frozen with his termination notice in his hand, because some things have to be said aloud in front of witnesses to undo the thing that was done aloud in front of witnesses. He said that the woman the director had just called a night nurse, the woman he had ordered to stay in her lane, the woman he was at this moment trying to escort from the building, held the rank of captain. He said that she had served in a forward surgical detachment in conditions the people in this corridor could not imagine, and that she had been decorated, that she wore, when she chose to wear it, which was never, an honor that fewer than 100 living people in the country had been awarded. He said that on a single night, under fire, with the position being overrun and the credentialed and the confident all frozen or fallen, she had kept 11 wounded soldiers alive with her 2 hands and a headlamp and a refusal to stop, and that he knew this, that he could testify to it because he had been one of them, because he would have died on a road in another country 11 years ago if this woman, this night nurse, this officer, had decided that night to stay in her lane. And he lowered his hand at last, because his strength was going, and Maren crossed the corridor in 3 steps and caught him as his legs gave and eased him back toward the bed, and the last thing he said as she lowered him down, said to her now and not the room, in a voice almost gone, was the call sign, one more time, like a benediction. "Lantern!" The corridor was utterly silent, and into that silence the truth of the past weeks arrived all at once for the gathered staff. The recalibration the moment had been building toward, the moment when the people who looked at their shoes have to look up and see what was in front of them the whole time. Faye was crying. Priya Nandakumar had her hands over her mouth, and the staff who had been told to keep their distance from the dangerous night nurse looked at the woman kneeling by the general's bed, the woman who had taken command in the dark and saved 8 of their patients and never said a word about who she was, and they understood, in the way a crowd understands a thing all at once, that they had been wrong, that the system's estimate of her had been wrong, that competence and integrity had been standing among them in plain blue scrubs the whole time while they deferred to a tailored suit. But the salute, satisfying as it was, did not by itself save anyone, and Maren knew it, and this is the part of the story that matters most, the part that separates real vindication from the cheap kind. Because Howard Pace was still the director, the vendor was still billing, the man on 2 boards was still counting the margin. A general salute in a corridor could restore Maren Cole's dignity, but it could not stop the thing that was killing the forgotten, and dignity was never what she had been fighting for. So even in that moment, even with the general's salute still hanging in the air and the staff's eyes finally open, Maren did not gloat, did not turn to Pace, did not savor it, because savoring it was not the next necessary thing. She settled the general, checked his pulse, called for someone to bring him water, and then she stood and turned to Howard Pace and said the only thing she said to him in the whole long ordeal, said it quietly, without heat, in the flat, factual voice of a person stating a fact. She said, "The evidence is already out of the building." And she watched the last of the color leave his face, because he understood, finally, completely, that he had lost, that the night nurse he had dismissed had beaten him not with rank or with rage, but with the one thing he had never imagined she possessed, which was the patient discipline to build a case while he thought he was managing a problem. That afternoon, while the salute moved through the hospital as a story and the staff looked at Maren with new eyes, the woman from the state health department arrived with 2 colleagues and a sealed authority that Howard Pace could not refuse, and they took the records, the real ones and the altered ones, and the lab's findings, and the chain of custody Maren had built vial by vial in her small square hand, and the careful map of the money that Vandermeer's inquiries had drawn, and the sworn statement of a retired 2-star general who had watched the director alter the logs with his own hands. And the thing that had hidden for years inside the expected, inside the ordinary arithmetic of poor people dying in forgotten hospitals, came out into the light at last, because someone had finally insisted on looking, and because the someone had known, from a life of documentation under impossible conditions, that you do not fight a system with anger, you fight it with proof. The reckoning, when it came, was real, but it was not clean, and Maren Cole had known it would not be, because she had learned long ago that justice in the actual world is a slower, grayer, more partial thing than the stories promise. Howard Pace was placed on administrative leave within the week and resigned within the month, and there were investigations, and the word criminal began to appear in the careful language of the people conducting them. But a man like Pace had lawyers, and the wheels of consequence turned slowly, and Maren understood that he might, in the end, face less than he deserved. The man who sat on 2 boards resigned from one of them with a statement about focusing on his other commitments, and the foundation issued a release expressing concern, and the holding company restructured, and some of the people most responsible for years of quiet deaths would, Maren knew, simply move their money and their names somewhere else and continue, because that is what systems do. They protect themselves and the people inside them pay. She had no illusions about that. She had told Priya as much, in one of the few moments she ever spoke about it directly, that they would not get all of them, that they never got all of them, that the work was not to win cleanly, but to make the lie cost something, and to save the people you could actually reach. But some of it held. The vendor's contract was terminated, not just at St. Brennan Mercy, but across the dozen hospitals it had quietly poisoned, and the real medication came back. The right concentrations, the honest labels, and somewhere in 3 states, patients who would have died on a Tuesday night did not and never knew why. And that was the part Maren held on to, the unglamorous arithmetic of lives saved in the dark by a truth that surfaced in time. The state opened a review of medication supply oversight in underfunded hospitals that would, slowly, change the rules in a way that would outlast everyone involved, and the deaths on 4 East, the 3 before the outage and the others stretching back further than anyone had wanted to count, were finally examined honestly, and the families, some of them, got answers, which is its own kind of justice, the kind that does not end the loss but at least refuses to keep lying about it. Maren Cole was not fired. The termination evaporated the way bureaucratic actions evaporate when the person who initiated them is gone and the ground has shifted, and she was offered, in the awkward institutional way of a hospital trying to make amends, a promotion, a daytime role, a title, recognition, a chance to step out of the quiet and into the light her competence had earned. She turned it down. She thanked them, and she turned it down, and she asked instead for 2 things. She asked that the night staffing on 4 East be brought up to the grid the budget had been cutting for 9 years, because the outage had nearly been a massacre, and the next one might not have a captain in the building, and after everything that had happened, they could not refuse her. And she asked to stay on nights, because the nights were where she belonged, where the forgotten patients were, where the next dark would come, and someone would need to be the one who did not stop, and because she had discovered in the long ordeal the thing she had been trying not to know for 11 years, which was that she had never actually wanted to escape what she was. She had only wanted to choose it freely in the quiet on her own terms, instead of having it demanded of her by the worst night of her life, and now she had chosen it. She kept the coin in her left scrub pocket. She still touched it sometimes without knowing she did, but the box at the bottom of her closet, the one she had not opened in 3 years, she opened now, and she took out the ribbon, the blue one with the thin silver band, and she did not pin it to her chest, because that was not who she was, but she set it in a small frame on the windowsill of the apartment with the cat and the single chair, where the late afternoon light came through before her shift, so that the captain and the night nurse could finally live in the same small room without a seam between them. Ezra Vandermeer's heart was failing, and the salute in the corridor had cost him strength he did not have to spare, and 3 weeks after the day he stood on legs that should not have held him, he died in room 9, in the small hours, on Maren Cole's shift, with her hand in his the way his had once been in hers on a road in another country. It was, the chart would say, expected. But this time the word was true, and this time someone was there who knew exactly who he was, and exactly what he had done, and exactly what the world had lost, and she stayed with him to the end and did not let go, because that was the promise, the one she had made him 11 years ago in the dark, and the one she had renewed without words the night he said her call sign, that she would not let go. Before he died, he made her promise one thing, which was that she would let herself be known, not the way Pace had tried to make her known, as a problem, but the real way, as what she was, so that the young ones coming up behind her, the Prius, would know that the quiet, competent person in the plain scrubs might be carrying more than anyone guessed, and would learn to look. She promised. She has tried to keep it in her own small way, which is not by telling the story, because she will never tell the story, but by being on every shift, visibly and unmistakably, the one who does not stop, so that the people around her learn what that looks like and carry it forward. Priya Nandakumar is not a frightened new grad anymore. She is 2 years in now, steady, exact, the nurse the others go to when the dark comes, and she carries in her own pocket a small thing Maren gave her the day her orientation ended, which is the brass coin, the worn one, lantern on one face and a number on the other, passed on the way such things are meant to be passed on, from the one who held the line to the one who will hold it next. Maren did not need it any more. She had learned what it had to teach her. And St. Brennan Mercy is still on the wrong side of the river, still serving the poorest and sickest part of a poor and sick city, still a place the world mostly forgets until 3 in the morning. But 4 East is fully staffed on nights now, and the medication is what the label says it is, and the patients in the quiet rooms have a better chance than they did, because one night nurse who had every reason to stay in her lane decided instead to notice things and to not stop, and to build the truth one vial at a time until it was too heavy for the system to bury. So here's the question this story leaves with you, and it is a real one, the kind that does not have a comfortable answer. When you walk into a room, any room, a hospital, an office, a family, and you sort the people in it by their titles and their volume and their tailored suits, who are you not seeing? Who is the quiet one in the plain clothes at the edge of your attention, the one you have already filed away as just a something, just a nurse, just an assistant, just a temp, just a kid? Because the truth the loud men never learn, the truth that cost Howard Pace everything, and that a dying general spent his last strength to say aloud in a corridor, is that competence does not announce itself, and the people who hold the line are almost never the people the room is looking at. And so you have a choice, the same choice the staff on 4 East had, the same choice we all have every single day. You can keep deferring to the rank and the volume, keep looking at your shoes when the loud man raises his voice, keep mistaking a uniform for the person inside it, or you can learn to do the harder, rarer thing, the thing that the whole long story of Maren Cole was really about. You can learn to look. So tell me, down in the comments, which one you want to be, the one who defers to the loudest voice in the room, or the one who finally learns to see the quiet person holding everything together, and tell me about a time someone you underestimated turned out to be the one who saved you, because I read these and I want to know. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Some heroes never ask to be seen, but they are always, always worth the salute.